Esther chapter 6. Now remember in chapter 5, Esther had presented herself to the king and invited him and Haman to a banquet, and then invited him and Haman to another banquet. And then that's the end of chapter 5 ended with Mordecai speaking with friends and family, and then they come up with this plan to have Mordecai put to death. Because of this great way in which he has um, basically hurt the pride. I mean, that's what it is, hurt the pride of Haman. And so so we pick it up here in chapter 6. We're kind of waiting on the next day for the next banquet to take place. And so chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, What honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? And then said the king's servants that ministered to him, There is nothing done for him. And the king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. And so Haman came in, and the king said to him, What shall be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king and said, For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and the horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal, whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man to whom the king delighteth to honor. And the king said to Haman, Make haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. And then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and he brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. And then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife to him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shall surely fail before him. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. And so again, what we see here is if we took this and separated it from the context of everything else that has been taking place, we might think that these were just kind of some random consequences, some random events taking place that just kind of happened to fall in a strange order. But we also know and we understand that is not how the book of Esther is portrayed to us. Without ever using the word, we understand that the book of Esther, the author of Esther, is very clearly and painstakingly showing us the way in which God is working behind the scenes. Maybe the best way to say it, working behind the scenes. And so on the night between the two banquets that Esther had thrown for the king and for Haman, the king finds himself unable to sleep. All right, we've all been there. We all know that, there's sometimes you just cannot get back to sleep no matter what you do. And so he has somebody come in and just says, Hey, just read from the record books. Right? That ought to be boring enough to knock me right out, right? That's kind of what he's thinking. And so the person is reading, and again, in our language, the way that most people might describe this is that they just happen to come upon, and they just happen to read the story when Mordecai foiled this assassination plot against King Ahasuerus. And so that gets the wheels turning in the mind of Ahasuerus, and he asks, what did we ever do for him? Right? Obviously, this was a tremendous thing. It could have changed the course of history. And Mordecai stopped this. He saved my life. How did we repay him? And just as a historical note, again, we have some historians, Herodotus among them, that tell us that this is typical, not just for Ahasuerus. He did do this, but for kind of Persian kings in general. If somebody were to aid them or help them in some way, particularly in a manner such as this, they would kind of lavish gifts upon them. It was Not uncommon for something like this to take place. And so he wanted to repay Mordecai. He wanted to reward him. And so, like I said, this is just another in a long list of providential acts of God that we have seen in the book. And so what seems like just a normal sleepless night for King Ahasuerus was in actuality God moving to bring about his will. And why I want to keep harping on the particular instances of Esther, because I think Esther is one of the more relatable books in that, again, we don't see God parting the seas, right? The people aren't being raised from the dead. We're not seeing Jesus bless the bread and the fish and feeding 5,000 people. But what are we seeing? Somebody couldn't go to sleep. Somebody threw a party, right? And so we're seeing these normal acts, these kind of everyday instances, and yet God was still working. He worked just as much the night that Ahasuerus couldn't go to sleep as he did when he split the Red Sea, right? He was working just as much to have Mordecai exactly where he needed to be to hear that plot against the king as he did when he's bringing the plagues against Egypt. Right? It's all the same sovereign God. It's all the same as far as God moving to bring about his will. And so I say all that to say this: coincidence, you've heard me say this in the past, coincidence does not exist. Coincidence cannot exist in a world where we have a sovereign creator. Right? When we have a truly omnipotent sovereign God, he is never in heaven hoping or thinking, I'm really glad that things worked out that way. Right? That just doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. And I love the verse from Daniel 4. It says, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And then he says this, and he doeth according to his will, obviously speaking of God, in the army of heaven. But then he also says this, and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? And the reason why I love this verse so much is because he says he's doing his will. He's moving things. He doeth according to his will, not only in the army of heaven, but amongst the inhabitants of the earth. And I like the word that it uses there, inhabitants. It doesn't just say he does what he wants with the kings. He does what he wants with the movers of the nations. That's not what it says. It says that he does what he wants among the inhabitants. That's you and I. We are the inhabitants of the earth. And so God is working all events to come to make his will come to pass. Now, sometimes he does that through causing events. Sometimes he does that through allowing events, right? We see both in Scripture. He sent his son to die, and yet Jesus died by God using the free choices of evil people to murder his son, right? Well, did God determine that? Yes. Did he cause the wickedness in their heart? No. But he used it. He uses all things providentially to bring about his will. And so Esther shows us this in such a beautiful way. And I'm so glad that we have a book like this so that we don't sit here and think, well, if it's not the waters parting, it's not God. Right? If it's not this grand miracle, it's just not God. No, God is in all of it. God is in all of it. And so here, what is he in? He's in a restless night. King couldn't sleep. And that was just God working. And so, again, working in, maybe for lack of a better phrase, working in the mundane, working in the everyday events. And so this is exactly how things played out. And it's a very important point within the book of Esther. And so it was at this time that Haman comes to visit. And the king lets him come in. Now Haman is there for the express purpose of essentially getting the king's permission to kill Mordecai. Right? That's why he's there. He's there to talk to the king, to have Mordecai put on the gallows. And at that particular time, before Haman could get his question out, the king asks Haman, hey, what do you think I should do for the guy that I really want to bestow honor upon? Right? There's somebody I have in mind, and I really want to honor them. What do you think I should do? And in what has to be one of the most hilarious stories in the whole Bible, Haman, in his pride, can't even begin to imagine that the king is talking about anybody other than him. Right? It never once did it enter into his mind that the king could have possibly be thinking about somebody else other than Haman when he said that. And so Haman pridefully just starts spouting all this stuff. Oh, you need to give him your robe. You need to put him on your horse. You need to have one of your most noble princes array him in your clothing and lead the horse through the streets while shouting, this is what Ahasuerus does to the man he wants to honor. Right? He's just trying to think of every possible thing he could so that he could heap more praise upon himself. Right? That's what he's trying to do. And the funny thing about all this is if that's not funny enough, is that Ahasuerus thinks that's a great idea. Man, you really nailed it on the head there. That's exactly what I should do. And not only that, Haman, you're going to be a part of it, right? And so he tells him, you know what? Go and do that for Mordecai. And so you can probably just sense how Haman was just struck in that moment, and how he thought everything that, he had all these plans, right? Everything is lining up. The queen loves me, right? The queen has invited me to all these banquets. I'm going to go to another banquet tomorrow. I have the ear of the king. He's already given me his seal to make this proclamation. And here he's invited him in. He's asking him these questions. I've been promoted to one of the highest levels. Everything's falling in line. I'm rich. I got a great family. I got all these friends, right? Everything's falling in line for old Haman. And then the king says, oh, by the way, go and do that for Mordecai. You can just sense how everything just collapsed for Haman at that particular point. Probably there's no other story in the entire Bible that illustrates as well for us what we read in Proverbs 16:18. Pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Right? This is that on display. And this is exactly what happens here with Haman. Now Haman's answer here to the king, it really exposes his heart. Because what he does is he's searching for something. What he's searching for is the praise of men, right? That's what Haman wants. He wants the praise of men. I don't want just money. I don't want just a good family. I don't want just the position. I want everybody else to know I have those things, right? I want people to see me with those things. And so if I'm being led through the streets by one of the other nobles and they're shouting out about my praise, my glory, my honor, right, that's exactly what I want. And so he's exposing his heart in this, which of course we already had a little bit of an idea of this, maybe not quite to this degree or to this level. But before we want, and I always want to do this, before we point the finger too much at Haman and just think, oh, what a terrible guy that he is, which I'm not trying to say he was a good guy, but before we point the finger too much, we have to also understand that we have to guard ourselves against such a problem, right? Haman is not the only person who's ever been struck with the sin of pride. All right, this is something we all must guard against. And this is such a pertinent and a verse here in John chapter 12 that will hopefully open our eyes to this. In John chapter 12, it says, nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him. That's important. Many believed on him, obviously speaking of Jesus. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Who is that talking about? That's not talking about just anybody. That's not talking about the unbelievers. That is specifically talking about the people that it just said believed on him. Right? The ones that believed on him were afraid of getting put out of the synagogue because they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. And so again, we want to be slow to point the finger and all this and without having looked at ourselves, right? And making sure that we're not succumbing to the same problems, succumbing to the same sins that Haman and obviously so many others have fallen prey to, that being the sin of pride. And so, as we've already seen, the king the king loves his advice. He takes his advice. Again, kind of another example of Ahasuerus, taking the advice of other people. He does it here again, and he tells Haman, go do what you said to Mordecai. And so, to his horror, right, and again, it's hard. It is funny. To his horror, he would now have to lead Mordecai through the streets after having put all the royal apparel upon him. And he would have to lead the horse to the streets and shout out and proclaim, thus, the man whom the king delighted to honor, right? Everything that I wanted is now placed upon him. And so God turned Haman's pride into Mordecai's praise, right? The Bible is quick to tell us, let somebody else praise you, right? You don't have to lift up yourself and say, hey, everybody, look at how great I am. If you're truly great, let others say it. Right? And so here, again, Haman's pride turned to Mordecai's praise. And so Haman returns home. He's angry. He's humiliated. Now again, keep in mind that nothing has changed about Haman's status. Right? I mean, in the eyes of Ahasuerus, Haman is still a very important person in the kingdom of Persia. Haman is still a very important person. As far as we know, he still has a large family. He still has riches. He still has many friends. He has everything that one would desire to have And again, as we've already seen, it's just this one man. All right, the insolence of Mordecai is the thing that just drives him crazy. And so he comes home, he's humiliated and all this. And it's at this point, and this is kind of interesting here, his wife and his friends give him kind of what to us might seem an unexpected prophecy. And so they tell Haman, they said, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shall surely fall before him. Well, this seems very prescient here. I mean, they get this right. Everything that they say is true. And so what is happening here? What seems to be taking place here is not necessarily a prophecy from God. Not necessarily that God put a prophecy in their lips, although he could have done that. But what seems to be taking place here is that within the realm of their religious understanding and their religious thinking, they saw some bad omens. That's kind of what seems to be the case here. Let me quote Constable. He said, they saw in Haman's humiliation before Mordecai, the powerful, honored Jew, an omen of even worse things to come. The tide had turned, and Haman was now powerless before it. Now think about what Haman had just done. Right? Haman had just had the king seal a proclamation that all the Jews in the kingdom would be put to death. And then what did he just personally do? Lead a Jew through the streets while claiming this is the guy that the king wants to honor. Right? And so the people, his friends, his family, they look at this and think, Haman, this don't look so good. Right? Things don't seem to be working in your favor when it comes to Mordecai. And we have this proclamation coming at the end of the year, right? Things are falling into place, not necessarily in the way you want them to anymore. And so, again, I don't want to come here and say that God gave them a prophecy. Now, again, that could be the case. I don't think it is. I think they just were reading the situation and they read it right. And then the chapter ends, verse 14, the chapter ends with Haman being hasted away. That's kind of the word that's used there, that he was hasted away to Esther's second banquet. Now, if you're Haman here, again, things have been bad, but obviously, it's in his mind, well, I'm still on top, right? I've still got all the things we talked about earlier. I've still got all that. I'm still on top. And not only that, here is the queen who has not only led me to one banquet, but is bringing me to a separate banquet, a second banquet. She clearly, sees something in me. I clearly have a good relationship with the king, right? So things seem to be going my way. Maybe not as much as I had hoped, maybe not as exactly as I thought, but things seem to be going my way. It was a glimmer of hope for what was a defeated man. But, as we're going to see next week, as bad a day as Haman was having, it was nothing compared to the day that was about to come for him. And so I'll close with a word of Brenneman here. He said, they now realized that Mordecai had with him the God of the Jews, and Haman would not survive his attack of Mordecai. And so this is what we'll see. Again, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll let the book unfold as it does. But again, we have to be very, very careful, and we have to be very understanding that God is moving. Don't just think, I can't go to sleep tonight. Well, it was probably not a coincidence, right? Well, why did these things fall out exactly as they did? It was not a coincidence, right? And I can't sit here and tell you exactly why all these things happen. It could be a consequence of sin. It could be God just trying to get your attention. It could be God trying to bless you in a way, right? But again, don't just throw your hands up in the air and think, well, nothing happens for a reason. That's not true in a world with a sovereign God. So Esther, I think, shows us that really beautifully. And again, I'll use the word, even in the mundane, even in the normal, everyday events. So again, very thrilled to have the book of Esther. Okay,